Welcome back, everyone. This is Governance Behaving Badly. I'm going to start off with some quick introductions. So, Zargan, do you want to go first?
Sure. I'm Michael Zargam. I'm the founder of a R&D company / group called Block Science, and I have a PhD in systems engineering from the University of Pennsylvania. I'm working on a wide range of organization and mechanism designs at the moment.
Great. Tarun?
Hi. Apologies for my video might not be so great because my internet's not really great. But I'm Tarun. I founded a company called Gauntlet, which sort of does optimization of DeFi protocols, participates a lot in governance, and also invest at Robot Ventures, and have written sort of a lot of the early papers sort of that prove why these protocols work.
Great. Dennison?
Hello. So my name is Dennison Bertram. I am a co-founder and CEO of Tally. Tally is one of the primary tools that folks use to manage their on-chain communities in the Ethereum space. We support protocols such as Uniswap, Compound, ENS, Gitcoin, and many others. So folks actually manage, billions of dollars in their treasuries through tools such as ours.
Great. You all probably know me already. I'm Sybil. I'm one of the managing directors at the Rock Center for Corporate Governance at Stanford. I want to quickly just give an overview of what we're going to cover today. So we'll start by defining some concepts. Then we'll look at some of the different ways that DAO governance can be manipulated or exploited through multi-sigs, bribery, plutocracy, takeovers, and Sybil attacks, although that's a lot, so we'll see what time permits. And then hopefully provide some practical tips for mitigating the risks of governance exploits. So let's define some concepts. This is a session about DAO governance behaving badly. I want to break that into parts. Tarun, I know this has been done a few times already on different panels, but for purposes of our conversation right now, can you provide us with an operating definition of a DAO?
Yeah, so I think a DAO stands for decentralized autonomous organization. I think the level of autonomy in different DAOs can vary quite a bit, but I think the main important pieces are that there is a mechanism for a group of people to collaborate on a collective pool of funds, and they can basically collaborate on how that gets spent, how that gets distributed, but also sort of they have some notion of both an ability to vote on such things and B, an ability to exit. So they can somehow have a way of exiting the DAO and sort of exiting with their funds. That's sort of a very high level description. I think the main thing to distinguish a DAO from is what I would call the multi-sig plus group chat equivalent, which is basically a group of people who control funds together, but they have sort of, the governance doesn't have provenance on chain in a manner that is inspectable by other parties.
Are you suggesting that the multi-sig plus group chat is not a DAO as you understand that term?
Yeah, because you have no sort of, there's no, the execution of the actual voting and wherewithal of the participants is sort of separated from the actual discourse on it. And sort of in a DAO that say is, say something that forks Compound Governance's contract, for instance, Governor Beta or Bravo or the original, there's effectively this sense in which the actual proposal is on chain. People are actually voting on that thing, and then they're using that to disperse funds or change protocol parameters. And there's sort of this data provenance factor that's extremely important. Whereas in the multi-sig plus group chat, you don't really have data provenance. You don't know that the execution is tied to sort of certain events that have taken place.
All right, so Dennison, what do we mean when we talk about DAO governance? Like, are there things that fall under governance versus operations? You can parse that a bit.
Ooh, that's a good one. First of all, I really like Tarun's sort of explanation there about the on-chain provenance and multi-sigs. I think that is a great defining line that's really important. For governance versus operations, I think the line there is pretty vague, right? If you have a protocol which will do nothing without the action taken by the voters, it's a little bit hard to pick governance apart from operations, whereas like the operations are the actions that are enacted by the governance, right? You could certainly say that like loading up the petty cash drawer and throwing a party is not really something that you'd normally think of as being governance. But if to get the money out of the treasury to do that requires a vote, then it does kind of fall under governance, I think. Additionally, governance, I think, means to different protocols and communities different things. In the DeFi protocols, you tend to think of governance as the levers which actually control the parameters of the protocol that it is sort of like established for. So you can imagine something like in Compound or in Aave, changing rates or collateralization ratios, things like that. Whereas other communities may not have those same sorts of needs. Example I love to give is Dope Wars. They mostly use their governance to pay out invoices of their contributors. They don't have much in the way of like a protocol that necessitates governance per se, but they do have to collaboratively come together and agree, hey, we're going to pay out these contributors. So in a sense, they use governance to manage the levers of the social organization.
Right. All right, so we know what a DAO is. We know what DAO governance is. Let's talk about the behaving badly part. So Zargam, what do we mean when we talk about exploitation or manipulation of DAO governance?
So I think I want to make a distinction between the exploits and the vulnerabilities to exploit. And for that, I'll just give a shout out to one of my collaborators, Kelsey Nabin, has been writing her PhD thesis at RMIT, and this is one of her major focuses. So, give attribution where it's due. But the idea that there's governance vulnerability is that the structure of the organization has weak points in it. And so, and in some sense, these aren't completely removable. There's sort of trade-offs in the design space of an organization. But in particular with DAOs, we see a lot of these vulnerabilities. And then some of them are exploited. So whenever we see an exploit, what we're actually seeing is the consequence of a discovered and exploited vulnerability. And I want to make that distinction clear because a lot of these DAOs are in a state of being exploitable, but there might even be some questions about what particular activities are considered exploits, because some degree of political machinations may be appropriate. Even activist investors buying up tokens and trying to vote, depending on the extent of that, it could be considered an exploit or not.
Great. All right, let's turn to some of the different mechanisms for exploiting or manipulating governance. Some of these are more subtle, some may be considered outright attacks. And I want to start with multi-sigs, although there may be some disagreement about whether these smaller and perhaps newer DAOs that use multi-sigs are actually a DAO. But we heard yesterday, I believe it was in the So You Want to Build a DAO panel, that a lot of the organizations with maybe fewer than 100 million under assets are using off-chain voting. But with off-chain, the token holders can signal their preference by voting, but it's really just a signal, right? The actual on-chain execution has to be done by other means, like a trusted multi-sig. Zargam, are all multi-sigs actually required to implement the will of the community?
So I would argue that this is part of the social layer that I think Dennison was starting to evoke. In some DAOs that I'm a member of, we actually have a content addressed computational, like in code reference to a prose document, a community covenant. And in that environment, in a DAO that has that kind of environment, it is possible to sort of enshrine principles in addition to just rules. So from a sort of a constitutional theory perspective, we're getting into the boundaries between procedure and substance. And so in particular, I would argue, and I'll admit this is my opinion, that you can have a DAO that doesn't have all of its processes formalized on chain, that some of them are effectively written in prose, but preferably content addressed so that everyone in the DAO is very clear that the current constitution of the DAO says, for example, that the members of the multi-sig are representatives of the broader membership and that they can act on their behalf. I do agree, however, with something important that Tarun pointed out about provenance. So even in an organization like that, there still should be a very high burden on the sort of demonstration that you have in fact followed through on the will of the community according to whatever processes you laid out. So maybe I'll leave it for a moment, but it's simply put, a multi-sig may have the role of the decision-making body vis-a-vis board, and their decision goes and they're just taking advisement. We might contest whether that's truly a DAO. I do accept that it's not as decentralized by definition, so we might exclude it from our definition. However, it is a pattern that has emerged, and we might identify it as a vulnerability of insufficient decentralization.
So how many DAOs, just from your experience, Argam, are actually recording the purpose of the multi-sig and writing down in a covenant or constitution, the multi-sig must?
Well, very few. In fact, I would argue that the little bit that's starting to happen now is happening from bleed over from open source communities, because if you look carefully at the pre-crypto, like say data science open source communities, they have a high amount of constitutionality in the way they manage their markdown documents about contributor guidelines and merging to the canonical branch. And there's a lot of social institution around maintaining some of this really valuable open source code. And then there's an analogy now here to managing these really valuable data points, essentially the assets in these DAOs. And what I'm starting to see, at least, is in the communities that have longer open source contribution history, they're starting to port some of this sort of implicit constitutionalism in order to manage the subjective or substantive part of their decision making alongside the more automated procedural parts that come from like the DAO voting procedures that they've implemented.
Well, let me take a step back, actually, because even if there is a constitution or covenant of some kind where some of this is written down, and Dennis, I'll direct this to you, how are you ensuring that all community members are actually familiar with some of those formal rules that may be written down somewhere?
Yeah, I think the short answer to that is you're not. In these internet communities, it is very difficult to get people on board with reading things, right? Especially long form prose that speaks about the sort of like bureaucratic functionality of the DAO, especially for communities where that functionality isn't expressly codified in code, where it's just sort of like, hey, us multi-sig signers, we promise on the weight of our reputations that X, Y, and Z. And I think that is also a great, it's a weird sort of danger spot, because a lot of these values that you can, encode or display or like promise to users don't have any real weight in the blockchain sense. Right, we've tried to build decentralization with this idea that the smart contracts or the network is the sort of like final arbiter of the truth or actions. So when you codify these off-chain rules, you are building the social consensus on how things are supposed to work. But the catch is with multi-sigs is there's no enforcement, right? So it's sort of this idea where we all agree to abide by this, but if we steal all your money, there's nothing you can do. So it remains very much this strange kind of people's promise, which might work if you were publicly known individuals, in public office, for example. But in the DAO space, where many participants are rightfully or not anonymous, and or have worked hard to craft disposable identities, it's hard, at least for me, to really understand how in communities these sorts of like agreements necessarily hold the kind of weight that I think we're holding DAOs to in terms of like a standard. Right.
So even if a DAO is recording the purpose of a multi-sig, the multi-sig can still ignore the snapshot vote And like you said, Dennison, what can we do about that? But Zargan, maybe you can weigh in here. Are there ways to mitigate that risk up front?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the most important things to understand is that we're talking about, as Tarun rightly said, decentralized autonomous organization. So it's at some level, we're just talking about organizations plus two adjectives, which they may be more or less true for any particular organization. But like if we say that it's an organization, then it's pretty well understood that the right governance structure for an organization depends a whole lot on that organization. Like, what is it for? Now, many of them may be simple profit-seeking enterprises, and that's fine, but it's a subset of a much broader class of entities. And once you start to provide some requirements or some details, like, well, what are we trying to accomplish? Who is we? How does someone become a member? What affordances should they have? Are they capital rights? Are they governance rights? Are we coupling those? Why are we always coupling those? Like, there's so much going on here that the way you mitigate the risk is generally by starting with a sort of constitutive process of asking who is we, and trying to put a little bit of structure in place, minimalist as it may be, that actually suits the use case at hand. We see a lot of copy pasting of what I see as an inherently financialized model on organizations that maybe aren't that way. And conversely, we try to put a lot of maybe social infrastructure in organizations that are fundamentally just like capital managing entities. And when we blend those things together, we just get bad fits for everybody.
What about tools? I know there's Gnosis Safe Snap, right? That would allow automatic on-chain execution of off-chain votes without the need for multi-sigs. Do you see that as a potential solution here?
I think that's a great tool. I think as long as we actually structure the organizations to suit the needs of, literally structure the governance of the organization to suit the sort of purpose and membership, the intent of the organization, then we pick tools next. And the tools are used to fulfill functions. And if we're doing a process where that's what we need, then that tool is awesome. I'm just like hesitant to assume that the tools are the priority. Like for me, the first priority is understanding the purpose of the entity and try to get a minimalist governance structure that suits it. And then the more financial it is, the more some of these mechanisms are really good fits. The less financial it is, the more those, say, mechanisms that are basically capital rights bundled with governance rights don't necessarily make sense to me.
Mm-hmm. Dennison or Tarun, anything to add here?
Yeah, I certainly, I'm actually in the opposite camp where I think tools like SafeSnap aren't really a very viable solution for a couple of reasons. One is they're rarely the sole signer on a multi-sig. So we talk a lot about the dangers of multi-sig signers not enforcing the will of like a poll. But we don't talk about the fact that they're free to do whatever else they want without asking the community in the first place, right? Like, they can say, would you like ketchup on your hot dog? But they don't have to ask you if you want hot dogs, right? So there's that there where it's a little bit of a fog of like decentralization. We're like, yeah, well, do you want it? And it's not adding true decentralization. It's kind of adding like a shield to the outcome of a decision by the multi-sig holders, right? You can have it in any color as you want, as long as it's black. So it's sort of like, well, it works until it doesn't, as long as you sort of go along with it. I think the SafeSnap structure itself, and maybe Tarun, correct me if I'm wrong here, it relies upon the reality ETH module, which is kind of this like game theory setup, which actually, in my opinion, adds danger to DAOs by creating gameable mechanics by which you can actually create deliberate exploits. Sort of like just give a really brief idea there. If you were planning to sabotage a DAO, you would simply prepare yourself well to sort of shock and awe the community by backing a malicious proposal to such a degree that the sort of correct side would not be able to muster resources to block it. So those sort of tools, I think, they are a false sense of decentralization or a false sense of security. And while the intention is good, right? It doesn't solve the core problems, and in fact, maybe only introduces a wolf into the sheep anyway.
Yeah, I agree with Dennison. I generally think that First of all, we've seen that multi-sigs, kind of lose the most important property of cryptocurrencies, which is Sybil resistance. And we saw that with the Axie Infinity hack for the Ronin bridge, where 4 of the keys were controlled in the same data center. So it's like, there's sort of this weird, by the same sort of entity. And so there's sort of this weird thing of like, hey, we went through all this trouble to build these like extremely consistent and cryptographically secure Sybil resistance mechanisms, and then we throw them out, kind of out the window quite quickly when we go to this kind of multi-sig world. I have a even more militant stance. That's probably, I think only the financial DAOs actually make sense. Like they only have this sort of like self-consistent feedback loop. I think the ones where you kind of try to have governance rights without any financialization inevitably end up falling prey to some of the kind of like lack of Sybil resistance, or needing these kind of like crowdsourced things like reality.eth.
Great. And we will come back to Sybil resistance at the end, but Zargam, I think you have something you wanted to add.
Yeah, I think this kind of elicits a sort of like fundamental like framing gap, because I think I'm interested in and participating in a lot of things that are like small and professionalized rather than large and financialized. And so one of the arguments here would be that these things need to be distinguished from each other and not even have the same name if we want to frame narrowly, because I don't disagree with actually any of the statements that you guys just made, but they're extremely like, they're specific to the context of a large and financialized and ideally, again, very much identity-less environment. And in things that are professionalized and that involve labor that is not fungible because the laborers have to have skills, and we're not talking about capital anymore as the primary asset, but rather the capabilities of the contributors and how those capabilities are organized into capacity to complete tasks, suddenly has a very different flavor. And I agree with you, it does sort of destroy the Sybil resistance kind of, but in another way it introduces a Sybil resistance mechanism, which is extremely difficult to maintain multiple identities in those environments.
I think we could probably spend the whole hour here, but I do want to jump to another meaty topic, which is bribery. Because something of a market for vote buying seems to be developing in the Web3 space. And you can see this play out in something called the curve wars. So Tarun, I'm going to ask you to do the impossible here and explain the curve wars in just a couple minutes, and talk about the role that bribery is playing in the curve wars.
Yeah, so I think it might be a little better to give a little historical context to how we got to the curve wars scenario. And there are some analogs in traditional markets that kind of look similar, but I think I'll save that and just focus more on the history. So Curve is a automated market maker. It was sort of the second major automated market maker after Uniswap. And the key difference between Curve and Uniswap is that Curve was sort of adjusted to allow assets that are supposed to be roughly pegged to each other. So like 2 stable coins or an asset and a synthetic version of itself. It allows them to basically incentivize sort of keeping those assets pegged while also providing liquidity, sufficient liquidity for people to trade against it. And so Curve post sort of in DeFi summer decided to launch their token, CRV. And what happened was sort of at that time, people then built protocols that existed to basically farm, so collect as much of the Curve token as possible, and then dump it, sell it on the open market. And that caused Curve's price to crash. And so what Curve's DAO decided to do is they decided to effectively do a sort of buyback and lockup structure. So if you agreed to lock up your Curve for 2 or 3 years, you would effectively get a booster. So, maybe you put in $100 million of liquidity, you're earning $10 million of Curve a year. If you agreed to lock up your Curve for 2 or 3 years, you could earn $30 million a year instead. And so what that did is it reduced the amount of supply that was on the market. It also incentivized a lot of these protocols that were sort of trying to sort of farm the rewards and sell them to have a longer lockup period. And In the process, what happened is people started, you got both higher rewards and higher governance power. So the boost said, you know, you may own 10% of the token, but your governance vote is now worth 30%. And so Curve, as one of the largest venues in decentralized finance, people started to realize that actually you have a lot of these people who are locked up with their voting rights for 3 years, but they actually want some liquidity. So you could effectively pay them to borrow their voting rights. And why would you want to do that? Well, these automated market makers have a bunch of financial parameters. So these parameters are how much are fees, how much do you incentivize certain types of assets, which assets should you add or remove from the exchange. So Curve is not like Uniswap where you can create a pool trustlessly. It actually, governance has to create each pool individually. There's a bunch of reasons for historically and mechanistically why that's true. So people realize there's a huge set of people, at least a huge set of capital rather, that has these locked up voting rights and they're not using them. So people decided, hey, we'll actually pay to borrow their voting rights and then use that to list assets we want or increase fees or increase incentivization to certain pools. And then that got turned into a protocol itself called Convex, which effectively institutionalizes the bribery mechanism. And there's effectively an auction, if you want to kind of squint enough and try to make right sort of the economics of it, it looks a little bit like an auction where people are constantly using this protocol to buy percentage of the Curve active votes and then using that to change these economic parameters. And it has been kind of wildly successful in some ways and also wildly horrific in other ways, in that Curve's volume has gone down, yet it has more liquidity than it's ever had. And so there's a question of like, what was the DAO's KPI outside of, you know, optimize Curve emissions? And so anyway, long story short, or short story long maybe, that is sort of the history of how we got to this place. And now there's tons of protocols that have very similar mechanics.
No, that was actually a great and very concise summary. How much of this is unique to the Curve protocol? Are these forms of bribery likely to be replicated? Are they already being replicated?
I think they are, but only for, again, like protocols that have very large, some of the like sort of tea leaves you need to happen are, you need a bunch of remnant capital that's sort of locked up, but because it's like earning some sort of extra reward, but it's not kind of immediately utilized. So there's sort of this time preference deviation. The second thing is you need a protocol where there's actually a large amount of economics flowing through it. So, you know, Curve is generating tens to hundreds of millions of dollars in fees every month. And so it actually has a sort of, there's a lot of money that actually can be redistributed for it. So you kind of need to make sure the protocol is already sort of, you know, has this sort of economic matter ahead of time.
I think the point there, though, is that people replicate it whether or not those conditions are met. And that's one of the problems, is that people see, oh, look, it worked for Curve, and they don't really take the time to understand the preconditions for that. And so you see a first order degree of replication of the mechanism choice, but not necessarily a replication of the outcome.
And Tarun, you may have identified some of these already, but are there risk factors that make a DAO more vulnerable to bribery?
Yeah, so I think there's certainly a number of them. The first is this time preference deviation, where there's a lot of participants who want to have sort of like large percentage ownership of the DAO for a very short amount of time, and then other participants who are kind of longer term invested, but like not earning any returns or need liquidity. And when you have those two sides kind of, when you have enough of both sides of those, it's very easy to see like a market forming around them that's sustainable versus say, yeah, something where like someone just copies it and it kind of dies. Because there's no real economic substance. So then one side of the market, the one that's paying for the bribery attack, is unwilling to pay because they're not able to, like, their return on capital is negative. And so I think, you know, a very key point is that you have to have this like duration, like time scale separation between the different participants' desires to own the token. And that seems to be very fundamental.
Zargam or Dennison, do you want to add anything here about the risk factors that may help us identify DAOs that would be more vulnerable to bribery?
I want to make a specific comment about whether bribery is even technically a vulnerability, because in the case that Tarun's describing, I would argue it's not. You're talking about an environment where this is the intended behavior. And that kind of goes back to my point about purpose, is that in some systems, I would consider bribery like absolutely a problem. It is bad because it is allowing someone to come in and potentially manipulate governance decisions in a way that is not consistent with the organization's sort of function. But the system that Tarun just described is one in which having a healthy market that balances the financial interests between people who have the two types of time preferences he described is actually totally reasonable. And it's part of the reason why I like to distinguish vulnerabilities and exploits a little carefully, because again, here, I would not say that this is an exploit even. I don't know,
That's a really
Tarun,
good
if
point. Yeah, Dennis and Tarun, do you want to weigh in here? Do you think that there's a legitimate use case for bribery?
I do think there is a legitimate use case for bribery, right? Especially in a system where you can sort of like measure effectiveness just with numbers, like, you know, you make more money. Bribery allows you to kind of understand what the rational actions of actors are. I don't know if curve wars are actually a great example. The mechanism of these sort of multi-layers of protocols on top of curve it's very like bizarre that people lock up underlying curve tokens and then are able to emit their own tokens, which are a new governance token, which then others can lock up and then emit as curve tokens. Because it's also an interesting way for large curve token holders to actually exit their position without really affecting the market. So I kind of wonder if the sort of like curve wars governance system, the reason why we don't see it so frequently in other places is that maybe it serves more than one use case rather than just governance. But yeah.
Yeah, I wouldn't call it a vulnerability. In fact, I would call it actually like a better version of capitalism than we have in traditional markets. So in traditional markets, right, you have disclosure requirements for any type of takeover of say, like a public company. But the disclosure requirements are quite poorly designed, right? You only find out a quarter later, or you only find out like with some, you know, you only find out that say like Elon Musk bought 9% of Twitter, like way after it happened. In this world, the bribery is completely transparent, which is actually kind of a beautiful thing from a purely like philosophical lens. You at least see what's happening. You're not like hoping that a certain thing happens, or kind of having to spend this game of machinations of like what information actually exists that you can use to discern whether someone is doing such an attack. I think like the fact that it's transparent and people are able to have this discourse around such takeovers is a marked improvement from traditional markets. So
I would add though that there's a sort of there is an information asymmetry, but it's a like kind of technocratic one. Like you can build the infrastructure to make that information legible. It is all public in the sense that it's on chain, but there is a degree to which the people who build the analytics and or provide the visibility or legibility into those facts have a pretty powerful lever.
One more thing I want to raise regarding the Curve wars, because I think it's pretty interesting. So Curve has something called an emergency DAO, which operates sort of like a committee or sub-DAO that can take action without consulting all community members. And the emergency DAO recently executed its first ever governance proposal to kill all CRV rewards to a pool after it deemed a protocol's behavior to be a clear governance attack. And Amy Young actually talked about this a little bit yesterday with Maker having an emergency shutdown type protocol. I'm curious, do you guys think this is a good thing? You know, should DAOs have an emergency DAO that can take action without full community vote, or is this inappropriate in a permissionless system?
I could take that to start. I used to think it was inappropriate. because it just feels like another flavor of like, whatever the people want as long as it's Black. That said, I think we need to be practical about where a lot of these communities are in their life cycle. Most of these things are months, max years old. There are no 10-year DeFi protocols out there. And normally it takes more than 10 years just to build a normal company into something that you could say is a success. So for these protocols today to have emergency shutdown procedures or some sort of emergency control feels reasonable, right? When you look at the two sides of like what failure modes look like, governance attacks or just outright hacks are greater than emergency shutdown procedures, and then the sort of like community brouhaha that follows, but which is ideally recoverable from, whereas there can be governance attacks or hacks that may not be recoverable from. So I think that it's worth cutting protocols a little bit of slack in the beginning, that many of these things are not constructed over years of research. Many of these protocols get put together in all-night hacking sessions over a weekend or two, and they are not what we would consider fully baked software for the most part. So I'm going to put a little bit of like humanism in here and say that I used to think that it was inappropriate, but I think that for now it's the better option, considering the sort of like attack vectors that do exist and how adversaries today are extremely sophisticated and state sponsored. It's pretty difficult to make a claim that like a few folks, in San Francisco over a few weeks or a few months really can build a system that's impervious to nation states designing entire national security teams to exploit them, right? I think the idea behind the Axie Infinity Bridge, I think, was linked to a North Korean hacking group. It's not really reasonable to expect that level of security today. So yeah, I'm gonna break with my gut and say that I think it's okay.
I'd like to jump in on that too, because okay, so I'll be honest with you. I don't think that it's actually ever possible to be completely softwareified. Like, don't get me wrong, I think we want to make these things as robust as possible to limit the scope through which the actions of humans can undermine the key properties of these systems. But over a long enough time scale, which is kind of what you're inviting there, Dennison, you're always eventually going to have circumstances that need to be responded to. And so I view this, and I've been writing a bit, some academic writing with my collaborator, Kelsey, and we've tried to identify the difference between robustness and resilience and have a fundamental trade-off, because robustness is characterized in this case by this sort of immutable, unchangeable, no one can change, like can have this special powers. There's nothing that you can do. It works the way it works and you're on point, and literally it's stone. You can't change it. It holds the weight as long as it does. And if an existential risk comes in and breaks it, it just breaks because there's no adaptive capacity. In the other extreme, which is also bad, you have maybe these emergency teams. They represent that ability to identify and respond to that existential risk, and they create, on one hand, a great they're a great response mechanism, but they open vulnerabilities because they are by definition powerful, at least with some scope. And so they provide resilience or adaptive capacity at the cost of robustness. And so if you understand this as actually a deep philosophical trade-off space for institutions, every organization is going to kind of have to pick where it lands, and it may even evolve where on that spectrum it lives over its life. And in the story that you just told, Dennison, I sort of imagine higher degrees of resilience and lower degrees of robustness in the early lives of these things as they figure things out. But assuming they can ratchet down some of those powers, they may move away from resilience towards robustness. And this might actually be thought of as a kind of annealing. It's almost like an institutional or organizational annealing. For people who are familiar, simulated annealing is a concept in machine learning for starting with like really noisy stochastic things and removing some of the noise and kind of hardening down and finding a solution. And it's drawn from the concept of actually physical annealing. So I won't explain it more, but if you want to look it up, it's kind of cool.
I guess that I would maybe add one thing from a purely mechanistic standpoint, like sort of mathematically, why these things exist. So when curves started, effectively, Igorov, who's the founder, one of the biggest risks in DeFi at that time, which is actually grown substantially, was synthetic assets that are pegged, like lose their peg. And so part of the reason that happens is there may be another virtual machine, so like over a bridge, or a centralized entity like BitGo that somehow is unable to guarantee that there's a redemption policy that lets you trade one Bitcoin for one wrapped Bitcoin or one USDC for one US dollar actually holds. And so when that breaks, then the peg is lost. And when the peg is lost, these constant function market makers unfortunately have this property where if one of the assets goes to zero, the entire portfolio kind of loses its value. And so you actually have this like sort of existential risk to these mechanisms as they're constructed mathematically, where if you lose sort of these external stabilizing forces, like BitGo says, hey, we're not going to redeem any WBTC, and people are like, wait, my WBTC is worthless. That like those types of things are like actually quite important risks that are existential and have to be responded to in sort of a fast fashion. And in Maker's case, any system that has an oracle that does not so like endogenously stable effectively will have also some of these issues. So you effectively have, from a mechanistic standpoint, anytime you have external data external to the blockchain, crucial to the survival of that protocol, you do kind of have to think about those kind of very tail existential risks, and that's sort of, those need to be responded to quickly.
Yeah, they're not even just tail risks. I mean, they are tail risks in the sense of how bad they are, but they're actually not necessarily uncommon, because you're talking about a network of automations with codependencies. And the moment that you introduce any external ports, oracles, information from outside, this sort of, what I jokingly refer to as the fundamental theorem of automation is garbage in, garbage out. And so you have these backs from the outside world, and then you have a big network of codependent mechanisms, which are deterministic, conditioned on these non-deterministic inputs. And so the moment that something really bad hits one of those boundaries, it can absolutely blow up. It's what we call a cascade failure. When I worked on cyber physical systems, so like physical systems with digital systems entangled, things like power grids, this is a cascade failure. And we have a very real risk of cascade failures in DeFi for exactly the reasons that Tarun just described.
Great. I want to switch topics here, and I want to start talking about plutocracy. There is a bit of a plutocracy problem among DAOs. And Dennison, I'm going to put you on the spot for this topic. So can you start out, maybe define plutocracy, explain why a number of DAOs are plutocratic, and explain why plutocracy can pose a governance risk?
Yeah, so I knew that you were going to ask me that, so I was just like, oh, let's get the official definition. So the official definition of it is like a country or society governed by the wealthy. And that is probably the most succinct way to put a lot of DeFi protocols. And I would argue that that's not necessarily a bad thing. But to sort of start, a lot of these protocols require a large amount of liquidity to be functional. So they require a lot of input of money to work. The people who input that money kind of want some sort of control over how this money that's utilized, and the way that many of these protocols distribute voting power is also kind of linked to the amount of money that gets put into the system, right? So there's kind of a relationship between all these things, which naturally tends them to be plutocracies, where the people who contribute the most amount of money tend to have the most amount of say. This, to me, actually is not crazy, right? If you have the most to lose, maybe you do kind of deserve a larger lion's share of how it's going to work, because you can kind of assume that a person with $1 billion to lose is going to think through the decision, or at least have resources to marshal to make a good decision that are greater than somebody who maybe has $1 to lose, right? Some of this, of course, breaks when you can borrow large sums of money cheaply. But in general, that's kind of like setting the stage. For, you know, a thing that I kind of say in general, though, here around, because people tend to argue that that's not decentralization. And the sort of like thing that I say back to that is, if something were decentralized only for rich people, so that rich people could interact with something in a trustless way, it still, for me, is decentralized. It just happens to serve rich people. Now, a lot of people are going to push back on that, but it really depends on the nature of the protocol, or in my opinion, the DAO, and like what their focus is. Also, frequently, investors and large holders are kind of jump starting an ecosystem and environment that long-term may become more fairly dispersed. But in the early days, again, you know, there aren't decades-old DeFi protocols. They're still in that process of going to that sort of like thermodynamic dispersion of money.
Right. And it's not that different than what you would see in a traditional startup environment. I would like to talk about an example here, and sorry, Justin Sun, but this just was an easy one. So Justin Sun is a billionaire entrepreneur, somebody you call a whale, and he borrowed a bunch of compound governance token to launch a proposal to add TUSD as a collateral asset on compound. Some people called this a governance attack. Some people said it's not. I'm curious what you think. Dennis, and I'll go to you first.
Justin Sun is a unique case because he's a bit of a pariah in the Ethereum community. So there are things that other people would do and would be applauded for, and you know, people would call them so clever and so thoughtful. And when Justin Sun does them, everybody hates him. So it's a little bit, he's such a polarizing figure that it's difficult for anything for him to do. Like, there's virtually nothing I think he can do in the Ethereum land that anyone would ever receive positively.
Okay, so what literally, if we swap in a generic name there?
Yeah.
Any whale is borrowing a bunch of tokens to push through a governance proposal. Illegitimate or legitimate effort to sway governance in a decentralized space?
It's legitimate by way of the mechanism, how it works, but I think it's a bad idea. But
can I jump in? Because I think I want to make you're pulling up this like procedural versus substantive thing that I think just needs so much more attention. So it is legitimate procedurally, literally, to what Dennison is saying, but that if it is sort of perceived as, say, let's say the broader community sees that as somehow against their interests, even if it's totally intersubjective, as was the case with the Justin Sun thing, it basically becomes substantively illegitimate because the larger body of stakeholders is like, yeah, we're not cool with that. However, it's still procedurally like intact because the smart contracts enforced it. And so this is where we actually unlock again these questions of who are the stakeholders, what are their expectations of their say, or even just their expectations that the people who do have a say are going to act according to some, let's say intersubjective expectation of the purpose or the extent to which they should have their interests looked out for, even if they're not directly voting. And so if it's Justin Sun and people think that's totally bullshit, I don't want him doing that, then it's not okay. And honestly, if somebody who is adding a different person with different standing, adding a different token, people might just feel like, hey, yeah, that's consistent with how I expect the system to behave. And even though it's procedurally identical, there's a difference in the perceived legitimacy of that behavior.
So even if it's procedurally legitimate, are there ways you can mitigate the risk of a whale kind of subverting the governance process for his or her advantage?
I'm saying that's entirely normative. I'm saying that ultimately, even the idea that whale is doing a subversion is not something that you can know in advance according to the mechanisms. It's a social phenomena to the point. Justin Sun is actually a great example because of this, because we actually can just imagine someone else doing almost the same thing with a slightly different token and feeling differently about it. And not just us, like a large swath of people in this community. And that's a really good pointer to the fact that it doesn't ultimately resolve to a procedural thing.
Yeah.
What
Yeah,
about this?
and
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say, there's also kind of an interesting thing in what you just mentioned. Is there a way to stop these whales making this influence? If you rephrase that, is there a way to stop the winning voters from winning? And I think that sort of like gets to the heart of the matter there. Is it possible to stop a vote that's passing that you disagree with?
What about
Certainly,
moving away from, oh, go ahead, Tarun.
Certainly, I would say the Bitcoin community would argue that this is why you should never have governance, because it inherently has this sort of property that, yeah, the winners get to continue winning, and so I don't think there is a way to do it in any sort of form other than hoping that the network growth and token holder growth outstrips the ability for one to concentrate their power.
But a lot of this is tied to token voting, right? What about the idea of moving away from that towards something that focuses on reputation?
I'd like to speak to moving away from token voting, but I want to bridge off something I think it was Dennison said earlier, which is that the plutocracy makes perfect sense as long as the resources being managed are the financial assets of those wealthy people. Like, if you start from that frame of reference, then it's even hard to frame plutocracy as a bad thing. The moment you expand the stakeholder groups and you say contributors are users are ... maybe there are brand assets other than financial assets. Maybe there's, the thing grows, time goes on, entity complexifies, and the thing that make up that are being governed by the governing body is richer than just capital. Like, it's more complex, it's more things, and that the stakeholders are a broader, there are more classifications of stakeholders. Then you move away from things like token voting that is inherently plutocratic, because you need an organizational design that respects the interests of a variety of different stakeholder groups. And that's where you start to look at things like, say, reputation, which tends to come into organizations that need to manage based on what I talked about earlier, the time and effort of contributors becoming, okay, now the contributors are a core stakeholder group. They're not necessarily the same people as the capital provider. They have different expectations about governance rights. Maybe they don't even have capital rights. Maybe they only have governance rights. And you start to have to unpack this. So I'm gonna end this sort of sidetrack for the moment by pointing out that reputation protocols are themselves incredibly sensitive, meaning that when you start trying to create measurement apparatus for contributions, that becomes the next most critical attack vector or vulnerability. Like, whoever controls the measurement apparatus is going to have a lot of control over the organization, and actually the measurement apparatuses are almost always gamed. So you have to be really careful with any sort of contribution graph, metrization of contribution or reputation. But it is true that we need those kinds of things if we want to create an on-chain measure of these off-chain activities. But that does bring us back to Tarun's point earlier, because it is an external fact being broadcast on chain. So it is a vulnerability as a source of potentially bad information that cascades through a chain of automations.
Dennison or Tarun, anything to add on reputation?
Yeah, I mean, I think the good hearts law aspect that was just presented is a very salient point. Like, inevitably, the moment you do kind of choose sort of some notion of a metric for value of labor, you inevitably end up with that being gamed or at least optimized. A question of whether you consider it optimization or gaming is also an important social distinction, I think, in these communities. But yeah, I just don't really, I think effectively the reputation systems have a form of currency in that they are sort of, you are sort of creating some representation that isn't, people can sort of trade in some sense, or, implicitly buy your reputation later. And so it's actually extremely tricky to design these things. And I think we've seen lots of imperfect examples that have failed much more spectacularly than token voting historically. So we're sort of back where we started.
All right, let's spend our last few minutes talking about takeovers. And Tarun, I'm going to stick with you here. So what is a takeover in the context of a DAO? And maybe you can talk through the Beanstalk flash loan attack and or the Build Finance takeover.
Yeah, so I think one way of viewing takeovers is if you have a governance contract that's allowed basically what you could consider root access or sort of admin access to all state and all functions in the contract, you effectively can have something where a governance proposal is proposed that is able to mutate the state of everyone who is participating in a network's assets, and in the process, can lead to sort of these theft-like scenarios. And in the case of the Beanstalk example, basically someone made two governance proposals. The first was actually something that effectively sent most of the funds in the contract themselves. The second one actually took advantage of some deficiency in the time locking mechanism. And it effectively, they were able to get around that by having these two proposals run concurrently. But effectively, the takeover boils down to you're able to give yourself admin access to a contract, even though the admin access is initially the governance contract itself. So the smart contract that the token holders collectively own is usually the sort of administrator. You write a governance proposal to say, hey, actually pass me that right to my address. Once you do that, then you can kind of take out all the funds. And so there's this whole layer of, this space that I think people haven't totally figured out yet, which reminds me of like operating systems in the late 1970s and 80s when they didn't have permissioning systems. And there was no notion of user space, admin space, kernel space, all of these things kind of separated over time. And I think basically takeovers boil down to a sort of access control escalation from a sort of cybersecurity standpoint.
So let me ask you somewhat quickly here. Should DAOs have mechanisms in place to prevent a takeover? Let me throw out two ideas, one being time locks, one being poison pills. Maybe you can comment on those and any other thoughts you have on the right mechanism, if any.
Yeah, so I mean, time locks are obviously extremely useful, right? They allow...
Quickly, sorry,
time locks are extremely useful. They allow a user to exit when there's a decision made by the DAO that they don't agree with. The problem is time locks, like in the Beanstalk case, can be subverted if not well understood or designed in such a way that they can be subverted. So designing them from a purely like mechanistic programming standpoint is extremely difficult. It's not like a legal contract time lock. It is actually, you do really need to understand the state of the system. Poison pills, I think, are possible, but definitely hard, again, kind of very hard to design in the current governance landscape. I think the first thing we need is effectively a permissioning system, like this notion of users versus admins versus different roles. We just don't have that because blockchains are TI-83s right now. They're not like a computer yet.
I was actually going to say almost the same thing, except for that I do think that you can do a lot more of it than people are already doing. I mean, although we've largely written financial applications, like speccing like sort of access control applications for smart contracts is really not that hard, because it's all just mappings between addresses and giving methods like limitations on which kind. Basically, it's not just owner only, but literally like proliferation of whitelist like things. And not to say that it's easy, because it's not, but it's the same category of problem you described from the 70s, where you are quite literally designing from the beginning a hard separation between these various zones, and then using whitelist like contracts to actually implement them. We just haven't seen much of that. It's maybe the way I would have put it is the vulnerability that you're currently describing. The first patch for that is to implement more structures like the structures you just evoked in the smart contracts we're using for extremely valuable permissions.
Yeah, I will say there have been a number of very famous exploits of permissioning systems in smart contracts. So from a pure like, hey, how do we enforce this at the virtual machine level? How do we have like trusted locked memory versus unlocked memory? There's a lot of like very nuanced low levels details that I think make it actually quite hard to do in say like Ethereum right now versus
Sure.
say somewhere where you have sort of better access control over state. And you
So
know,
there's-
we'll for that.
Yeah, there's just like two layers. One is like effectively in the design space, whether people are even thinking that way. And if people are speccing things that way more, that'll also bring more attention to the low level changes that are needed to make it more intuitive and more reliable and less exploitable.